Okay. Well, thank you, Saba, for those comments. They were really very helpful, as well was the earlier discussion that we had about this. I want to take a lot of those points and just put them in the bank, to be honest. I think the stuff on backward-looking considerations is very interesting. One issue about whether we can disrespect the people we've already killed by continuing to fight. The way you made it sound was that we disrespect them in virtue of not including them in our proportionality calculation at the second point of decision. But it seems like that presupposes that we ought to include them in the proportionality consideration. So it kind of presupposes the point that, that you're trying to prove. But I think that there is, yeah, I think that there's definitely stuff that could be said along those lines, which I'll think through. So I think that's a really good point. And the reformulation of the victory not serving as grounds for new rights, I think that's what I meant, so I should clarify that. I'm inclined to think that in the hypo with the other state that at most it would be a legal right, like you say. I also think that there's a grounds for the no new rights grounded in war, which I didn't describe as I was talking it through, but which still gives me cause to worry about this, which is that if as I think warfare always involves grievous injustice, that's the reason why. So killing innocent people, and you need a really artificial hypo to come up with a case where you only end up killing people who are liable to be killed. And that's the reason why I think that it shouldn't be a basis for new rights, because it involves this egregious injustice on both sides. So I'd still want to say that any entitlement they have to the rock, to the new planet, would have to be it wouldn't be morally grounded. It would at most be the fact that they've established de facto control over it. Could subsequently become morally grounded by, inhabiting it, forming legitimate expectations, those sorts of things. So I'd resist that. And on the point that you made at the beginning about collective responsibility, I mean, yeah, I think that's right, and I think that actually your stuff on complicity is part of what has really got me thinking about this in terms of those this sort of collective action, these role-based things. So I think those two sides go together. I think there's an answer to the particular objection you gave, but we can talk about it later. Okay, so
at this point, we're going to bring this microphone. If you could use it to ask your question, and Danny will be bringing it to you. Seth, why don't you take the question?
Sure, yes. I'm just going to try and get a sense of... Okay, so I'm going to start with the people I don't know. I've got on the list, I've got Victor, Jeff, David, Dick Arneson, BJ, chap here, sorry, with the sunglasses, Francois and Adil, but instead of going in the order of people I know, I'll go with the order of people I don't know. So in the sunglasses, sorry. Could you say your name beforehand as well?
Yes, Larry Hinman from the University of San Diego.
Brilliant.
I was particularly intrigued by the final section of your paper and your talk about just negotiations and, and your claim that negotiation takes place all the way along the line, not simply at the end. And I thought that's an important insight, and I wonder if you can take this a little bit further. One of the ways I think of a just peace and its role is that it can come to shape the actual conduct of the war. And part of, presumably, a just peace involves precisely the types of negotiations that you're articulating in the fourth section of your paper, and the moral burden to try to engage in these negotiations as early as possible. So I'm just wondering if you want to comment at all on that issue about just negotiation and take it any further.
Right, yes. So there's a sense in which also having it as a, if negotiation does sort of part structure and it's always there as this option, that in part conditions the other norms that you need to observe, because you need to always leave the option of negotiation open, right? So this is one reason for adhering to the other constraints, because if you go completely, if you don't respect the constraints, then there won't even be the option of negotiation available. So it's something that continually perpetuates and propagates throughout. So yeah, that's good. That's a good thought. Thank you. Dick Arneson?
There's lots of interest in this paper. I want to go back to, if you've got the handout, towards the beginning, in 7 agents and 7.3. which are the relevant agents in war? Individuals, obviously, but I think also groups. And I want to make we need a couple of distinctions here, just a simple distinction. One distinction is what you called reductionism. Is there such a thing as ontologically as group agency and collective agency, and can we attribute agency and action and assessment? And can that be, does this exist at all, and can it be reduced somehow to what individuals do, or is it ontologically independent? So that's one issue. There's another issue here which I'll call individualism versus collectivism. And that issue is that it says that, okay, so let's just grant. Suppose there's collective agency. Suppose there's collective agency. The individualist versus the collectivist doesn't take a stand on that. Maybe there is. Well, let there be non-reductionist collective agency. That doesn't settle the question. The question for what you and I should do depends on what individually, what are the options we face? What are the constraints? Are some of these options forbidden? Are the constraints hard and soft? Do we have options not to do the best? What are the outcomes we can reach? What's the more, it's just that. And that's independently of, yes, we can evaluate the group. So here's the simplest kind of case, just to illustrate this. So I just thought of this while the talk was going. Michael and I are in a conspiracy to assassinate Jeff. So we're assassins, we're wrongful assassins. In the past, we've done conspiratorial acts, and what's going to happen is we are going to both, now going forward, we're going to both shoot at Jeff and he's going to die. So the group is bad collective, bad, conspiracy, bad, the group, is wrong for shooting Jeff. Doesn't follow what Michael or I should do. So let's just take my decision problem. Forgetting what's happened in the past, it's going to be a preemptive causation case. Hold fixed that Michael is going to shoot. My choices are, I either shoot, in which case, and shoot first. There's a side payment. If my bullet gets there first, and I'm actually the cause of death, a nanosecond before Michael's bullet, something good will happen. Flowers will be sent to my mother. Something, non-significant but not a big deal good. So my choices are, do the act that actually causes the death but does no harm to Jeff, because it doesn't make a difference in terms of David Lewis counterfactuals. Michael's bullet's going to kill him a second later anyway, and that's fixed, right? So my choices are refrain from shooting Jeff, no flowers to my mother, and Jeff is going to die wrongfully. But if I shoot, I grant that I cause his death. I don't think that's not relevant for moral constraints. But if I shoot, there's no harm to Jeff. He just dies a nanosecond earlier. And my flowers go to my mother. So I say, it's perfectly clear, a consequentialist will always say, the relevant thing here is what difference do you make? That's what's relevant. But it seems to me the deontologist should say just the same thing here. So let there be collective agency. Let there be the collective of Michael and I. The collective is guilty of murder. This is terrible, bad collective. Let there be as robust group agency as you want. Nothing follows about what I should do. So individualism versus collectivism is a different issue from the issue of collective agency and reductionism. They're just completely different issues. And then I should just say here that when I say that it's just the consequences, it's just the difference that I make. You do want to allow that there's a further issue about assessment of consequences. So to take an old example, there are things that happen in the past. It can be that me beating Ty Cobb's record, if I'm a baseball player, might be a relevant consequence for me to bring about. And that consequence, forward-looking, depends on what happened and what Ty Cobb did in the past, right? So there'll be issues about the right description of consequences. But still, so let me just stop. So is there a question? What do you think? And thanks for a great.
Thank you, and thanks for a great question. Yeah, no, this is something that I was trying to sort of flag by saying I'm not going to insist on a non-reductionist account of group agency. So I think that there are going to be interesting things that do follow subsequently, but I don't have anything to say in support of that. It's just a notion at the moment. I think you're quite right. The things that interest me in particular, though, are cases where you have overdetermination and small contributions. Right, so think of a Parfit-style harmless torturer case, where you've got 1,000 people, each of whom turns a little dial, and the current goes towards an individual victim, right? Each individual's turning of the dial only creates a tiny little bit of electricity. Each on its own would be barely perceptible. But suppose that if enough of them turn the dial, so we'll just say 700, right? No, this is a case where it's overdetermined, where you're acting together, and where what you ought to do is difficult to say, and you need to consider the things that the other people are going to do. And this is something that I think is entirely relevant to war, because each individual soldier who fights makes a negligible contribution, if any, to achieving the kind of the overall goals of the war. And yeah, obviously, if enough of them fight, then they will together achieve this, right? And the same is true of the harms that they do along the way. So I think that that's going to factor in. It can factor in down to what each individual ought to do. But then the thing that I think is interesting is, how do you say that the campaign as a whole is proportionate, right? Do you make that judgment at all, or do you just look at each individual soldier and say, of the options available to you, given the evidence you have about what the other soldiers on your side are going to do, what will be the one that achieves the best result with the least harm? Now, I think that it will be inordinately complex working it out from that individual basis. And I also think that it might lead to errors or misjudgments, which you need to have some kind of group agency in order to evolve. And that was what I was trying to get at when I said that even if you make it that individual evidence-based account, even if you get rid of any notion of groups at all, and you say, what ought I as a soldier to do? I need to think about the way in which my action contributes to the harms that are caused by my side in a different way from the way in which it contributes to the harms caused by the enemy. Right? So even though my action may be a necessary condition of the enemy responding in some harmful way, it doesn't factor into my evaluation, the evaluation of the proportionality of my action in the same way. So I think there are still going to be interesting places where collectivism has a say in the sense that you described. Okay, so I should probably move on to. I'll respond more briefly to the next person. Jeff.
Thanks. I had three really brief things to say. One, a thought about the suggestion that incurred costs should have some role in assessing proportionality looking forward. It seems to me that if the harms we've caused already count against the proportionality of our continuing, then there can be cases in which it would be disproportionate for us to go forward with the achievement of our just cause. But it would then be permissible for different agents, let's say a different state, to do exactly what we would have done. And yet it would be proportionate for them but disproportionate for us, because the harms that we've done to people in the past shouldn't affect the proportionality of action by others. In other words, the proportionality of my action surely can't be constrained by harms that other people have caused in the past, even in pursuit of the same goal. Just a qualifying point or clarifying point about another good point that Saba made, and that is that it seems to me that preventing deaths from having been in vain by achieving the just cause is a good bit more plausible in the case of the deaths of combatants who have died fighting for the just cause, which I think is a relevant element of proportionality. But it's rather less plausible in the case of the deaths of civilians on the unjust side who've been killed as a side effect of the action of combatants who are trying to achieve the just cause. It doesn't seem so plausible to suppose that they won't have died in vain if the just cause is achieved. So I think that the point that Saba made is of slightly more limited application. Just finally, a very vague thought about what you were saying. My sense is that, right at the end of your last comment, that is, my sense is that ad bellum proportionality really is compounded out of the proportionality of individual in bello acts, if you can put it that way, though it matters a lot the time at which an individual acts, whether, what contribution the harms that individual's act will make to proportionality. It matters when that act occurs in the course of the war. Thanks.
Yeah.
Because some of that
regarding the first point that the third-party state can wipe the slate clean, as it were, whereas the first-party state can't. So you'll recall that that one of the considerations in favor of the view that we ought not to wipe the slate clean is that it would disrespect those who have died not to do so. And Seth said, well, you're just presuming that you ought not to wipe the slate clean, but that actually gets order of explanation backwards. I think that what grounds a reason not to wipe the slate clean is considerations of respect. It's a very particular kind of deontic consideration in favor of not wiping the slate clean. Now, I think that makes Jeff's point just grist for my mill. If what grounds reasons not to wipe the slate clean are reasons of respect, well, that suggests that they're agent relative reasons, and that it applies only to the state that has actually killed the combatants, and not the third-party states who have not disrespected those who have died in the same way. So I don't know if this is a bullet for me to bite or whether it's, as I said, grist for my mill, but either way, it would follow from the basis of the reason not to wipe the slate clean that there would be different constraints on third-party states. And I had another point, but I forgot. Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. I think on the point you just made, it's interesting that it involves disrespect by the state. So suppose that the individual soldiers who carry out the campaign at the second stage are all numerically distinct from the soldiers who carried out the first phase of the war. You'd want to impute that the attitude of disrespect that gives that backward-looking consideration is something that has to do with the nature of the collective entity that is continuing the process. So even if it was, for example, an entirely new leadership, entirely new, well, I think that's, yeah, I'm on board with that possibility, definitely. And the last point, yeah, I think it's interesting that when we think about proportionality, we do look at it with respect to the war as a whole. So ad-bellum proportionality is understood in that way. So I think it's interesting, and I'm curious to know, or to think through how it's possible to look at that from the perspective of each individual action and compound it up. I think it might become irreducibly complex, but maybe we can talk about it later. And Francois was next on the list. I'm going to try and make each person on opposite sides of the hall so that this chap has to run around the most.
Now, as you know, I'm very sympathetic to the group agency story, although in other contexts. With respect to 8, I'll try to make this quick. You say, assuming that we have such thing as group agency, here are the kinds of reasons that can apply directly to group agent, to individual in virtue of their roles of membership of the group, or to individual irrespective of anything to do with the group. I think that picture is a bit more complex, right? Why can't you have reasons that apply to groups nested within other group agents as members of the groups? And then a possible other category, which people like Bill Ringe or Stephanie Collins have been calling collectivization reason, that is reasons that apply to us as potential members of groups. Insofar as groups or group agents are the only ones that are able to solve certain problems or can do it better, then it may be that we, qua individuals, or qua groups, have a reason to constitute groups that can do this. So that makes the picture even more complex, and I think that should be there.
Excellent, thank you. It's always nice to have one of your PhD students quoted to you. So Steph's at ANU. Yeah, I think that last point, I think it kind of goes into, so maybe the way I put it, irrespective of anything to do with the group, is bad. The point in that last category is that it's reasons that apply to individuals just in virtue of their being individuals. And collectivization duties, which are not irrespective of anything to do with the group, might apply to you in virtue just as individuals, right? And I think that those sort of collectivizations duties, so this is the sense in which if somebody's drowning and he can only be saved by the 5 of us working together to go out and get him, it's the case that we have these duties to organize ourselves in a way that is going to robustly ensure that he's saved. And one of the things that I think is interesting about that type of count is I think that applies very strongly to soldiers, right? So I think that soldiers just can't just take one another as these sort of fixed quantities who provide them with evidence as to what other people are going to do if they do a certain thing, right? They actually have to work together to reduce the harm that they inflict as a whole, and that involves making sure they do collectivize. So I think that's a good point, thank you. Adil.
Thanks, Seth. Really enjoyed the paper. So first on the negotiation bit, just for your own purposes, it might be helpful to distinguish between norms about how to negotiate and norms about what to negotiate over. So good faith would be an example of a norm about how to negotiate. No new rights, or no rights grounded in victory would be a good example of what to negotiate over. It might also be worth thinking about what counts as a negotiation, whether it has to be sort of a one-on-one interaction, or whether when George Bush gets on television and says, Saddam Hussein has 24 hours to leave Iraq, or will invade, is that a negotiation or is that not? Might be worth thinking about. With respect to the synchronic and diachronic stuff, I guess this isn't really an objection, but it's just something to note that when military strategists are planning a campaign, and they want to achieve, obviously, 100% of their goal or their just cause, if they accept your suggestions and they want to be smart about it, they'll craft their campaign in such a way that the synchronic and diachronic views will converge. So not only will the war as a whole be proportionate, but at each significant step along the way, continuing the war will also be proportionate, which means that basically the better strategist will be morally permitted to achieve more of their just cause. Again, that's not necessarily an objection. All moral rules can be manipulated and exploited and worked around by clever people, but it's just something worth noting. And so whatever your argument will be for taking the synchronic view very seriously, it should anticipate that people will strategize on the basis of those rules in a way to try to avoid them while achieving their aims and sort of be prepared for that.
Okay, excellent, thank you. I do need to ask, when you need us to stop, you must say. Yeah.
There's another 6 minutes.
Okay, excellent. So I'll be quick. Really like the points on negotiation, and the last point. Yes, that sounds right. I mean, this really brings out the contrast between the evidence relative and fact relative perspectives. Each of these examples is crafted on the assumption that some situations change, new things emerge, new facts emerge as you go along. And I don't think that I or anybody has a good account of how to deal with, how to balance those two, or how to understand those two aspects of permissibility in context of war. Okay, so I've got 4 people left on the list. So shall I take 2 questions at a time? You happy with that? So BJ and Victor. Sorry, I should probably give you Bradley J. Strawser, Monterey College.
No, that's fine.
So
2 very quick points. First, just to clarify the discussion between Saba and Jeff and yourself, the issue of this idea of discounting the sunk costs. So whether or not the incurred cost should be factored into forward-looking proportionality considerations, that even if we answer that question and we decide how we should, as Jeff was discussing last August, there's this idea that the cost of the deaths at this new point at time T2 in the war could be valued in such a way that redeeming their lives isn't. So this depends. What I'm trying to say is it depends what side of the equation you put that value. It could be that it affects, like you were talking about, from 1,000 to 1,050. We could view it that way. We could view it a different way, or perhaps we do both, which is that we say having those lives lost count for something successfully increases the good now that will be attained by winning the war. So it's that you could raise the from 1,000 to 1,050 on this side, but at the same time, now the good to be achieved has gone up, so it's a wash. Or you could think we should. Right, precisely. So my point is simply that just answering the question of how we should, whether or not those incurred costs should even count, only that's the first question. Then we have to decide which side of the equation it counts. So quick clarification there. Second quick point is, Seth, this is 24.6, where you ask, you worry about, even on an evidence relative sense, how could we have an overall proportionality standard given this individualist, if we're trying to do it in individualist terms, for the whole war. And I think 2 points here are relevant. One, I can imagine a soldier in war kind of constantly doing this, like kind of asking their superiors or looking into the news media or, I don't know, trying to get the best evidence they can to say, hey, what are the odds we're going to be successful now? And then next week, how have our odds changed? We lost that battle last week. We won that, so that you could see a soldier doing this. Now, I see your point. It may be irreducibly complex as how does that come down to that soldier actually pulling a trigger. But the point is that a soldier could be engaged in evidence finding throughout that could possibly change the proportionality decision. Your point is how could we have an overall proportionality standard on this? And I think maybe we just don't. There just is no overall proportionality standard. There's just different moral facts. There's fact of the proportionality decision at time T1. that the soldier has to make when he decides to go to war. Now he's at time T2, he looks at new evidence, and it's just a different moral fact of whether or not it's evidence relative proportionate at that time given the evidence. And these are not, there's no one overall proportionality fact, they're just new different moral facts that change as the war goes along, and the soldier just has to do the best they can to try to reassess new moral facts. So there isn't an overall proportionality standard.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so... Okay, right, so... Victor, yes.
Okay, so this one. So this is a bit like Dick Arneson's thought.
Okay, Helen.
Sorry? But there's a different kind of case, unlike the overdetermination cases, which is a bit like this. So I like to call it the lazy bastards. Let's make you and I the lazy bastards. There's some action X which requires some moderate effort. If you X and I X, 100 people get saved. If you X and I don't X, 100 people get killed. If I X and you don't X, 100 people get killed. If neither of us X, nothing happens. So I ought not to, if I can't motivate you to X, I ought not to X. If you can't motivate me to X, you ought not to X, because it's going to kill 100 people. But we ought to X. Both of us ought to X, and we can say, and then it's also true here, I think, that we're liable for the failure to save the 100, because it's just our lazy bastardness that's preventing us from being motivated to X, and we can't motivate each other. So even though it's true that I ought not to X and you ought not to X, the fact that we ought to X can ground a liability on us as a group, and that doesn't rely on group agency. On the backwards-looking stuff, I thought that you should distinguish beneficiary-centered reasons, agent-centered reasons, and relational ones. So there were reasons that we might say, we've done enough for you, lives have been lost for your sake in trying to rescue you. We might be able to rescue other people, but lives have been lost for your sake already, and that's an agent-neutral reason. That could apply to anyone. Other people coming onto the scene could also say, lives have been expended to you, even if they've been expended by other people. Then we might have agent-relative reasons. We've already killed a lot of people, and there's a difference between doing and allowing, so we ought not to add more debts to our ledger. And then there's relational ones. We've killed people for the sake of you. And so I thought it might be worth exploring those different kinds of reasons to see whether any of those backward-looking considerations is morally salient. I suspect that they have limited power, but it's worth thinking about them independently of each other.
Excellent, okay. Right, well, really, I want to just take those 2 points from Victor and say thank you. And the first point from BJ on redeeming lives, I think that's right. And as to whether they're constantly evaluating what they're doing, yeah, that makes sense. I think that the key thing for me is that they need to be thinking about what they're doing together. They need to be thinking about coordinating. And so there would still be space for a forward-looking account of war as a whole, proportionality. So that's those. Must I stop, or can I take one more?
One more.
One more, Helen.
Well, I'll be quick. I just wonder whether... I'm wondering how your thoughts might change if they do. If we drop this assumption that we're talking about inflicting harms on different people. So imagine that we haven't killed the people the first time round. Maybe we just blew one of their legs off of a whole group of people, right? And then we have to wonder whether we can inflict more harm on the same people. And it seems to me then we might think differently about how the proportionality works in a case like that. Because it certainly seems like those harms count an awful lot, right? The fact that I've already blown off your leg as a side effect once is a pretty good reason not to blow off the other one too. So I'm just wondering, is it helpful perhaps to think about what we would do if these were harms to the same people over again, as opposed to thinking about a totally different group?
Cool. I think that might help reinforce Saba's view, because I think that to risk the same person again would seem to be quite disrespectful to that individual. So that would seem to magnify it. You'd have to sort of do it in a way that didn't involve there being more harm at the second stage. So it may be that it's probably true that having lost one leg, losing the second leg is more harmful than, or well, maybe even less harmful, I don't know. Kind of diminishing marginal utility of legs, I'm not sure. Yeah. So, but then goes again second time. Yeah. Oh, no, I think that's interesting. I think that might support, my intuitions around that might support Saba's thesis about disrespect. Okay, so I'm going to stop. Thank you very much, everybody.
So we have a 15-minute break, and we'll come back at 11.